Okay, so we are talking about the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is a system that assists the nervous system in communication. It's how cells communicate with each other, and it's responsible for a lot of cellular messaging. So there's two major types of systems, types of glands in the endocrine system, and they're called endocrine glands and exocrine glands. So we will spend most of our time talking about endocrine glands, and then talking about exocrine glands to a lesser extent. But before we get into that, maybe let's just define what they both are. So an endocrine gland is ductless, meaning it secretes hormones, which are cellular messengers, secretes hormones into the bloodstream, compared to an exocrine gland, which has a duct, and it delivers its product directly to a specific location. So we'll be talking mostly about endocrine glands and the hormones that they release, and then the results of those hormones as they are causing cellular changes in different parts of our body. So here we're looking at an example of an endocrine gland and an example of an exocrine gland. So the thyroid gland is a gland that secretes hormone, and then the hormone goes into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream it can now go anywhere in the whole body. Compared to an exocrine gland, what they have here is a sweat in the skin. There are sweat glands, and sweat glands are going to just excrete sweat into a duct and then to the surface of our skin. So an endocrine gland is secreting something into the bloodstream so it can go far away all over our body. An exocrine gland is secreting something through a duct to a specific location. Another example of an exocrine gland would be like our salivary glands, where we're producing saliva and it goes going directly into our salivary ducts and into our mouth. So we're going to look in more detail at the different types of endocrine and exocrine glands. So just if we're talking about the general characteristics of the endocrine system, again, this is kind of just reiterating what I just said on the previous slide, that this is showing the difference between signaling from nerves, neurons, and endocrine glands. So both neurons that release neurotransmitters and endocrine glands that release hormones, these are two different ways of cellular communication. We will be seeing some similarities of how neurotransmitters and the nervous system acts similarly sometimes to the endocrine system, but the major difference is that a neuron releasing neurotransmitters is using cellular communication, but it is just within that very close proximity other nervous system cells, and endocrine glands release hormones into the bloodstream, and it can travel throughout the body to whatever specific target receptor. So you could pause here and look at the comparison and some of the similar ways that the nervous system and the endocrine system act, and we're going to focus from here on out more on the endocrine system. So these are some general characteristics of the endocrine system. These are the larger endocrine glands. You'll see, just starting from the top, the hypothalamus and the pineal and pituitary glands are in the brain. And then we'll talk about the thyroid, parathyroid, and thymus, which are all kind of here in this throat, neck, chest area. And then we'll talk about the adrenal glands. Ad means on top of, so adrenal means on top of the kidneys. Renal is kidneys. And then there are the gonads, the sex organs for males and females, testes in males, and ovaries in females. So let's look at some of this. Each of these are releasing hormones into the extracellular spaces, and then From there, it goes into the bloodstream and then goes on to target whatever that hormone's specific action is. So hormones are released into extracellular spaces around the endocrine cells, and then from there they go into the bloodstream and are carried to all parts of the body. So there's three general steps that happen in all hormone action. Reception, transduction, sometimes this is called signal transduction pathways, and then response, which is responsible for whatever cellular activation that hormone is causing. So this isn't a chemistry or a biochemistry class, but we're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry of hormones. Hormones can be made up of different types of macromolecules. We can have steroid and non-steroid hormones. We're going to look at a lot of different examples of these. These are some cellular structures. You can see that this is cortisol, norepinephrine, parathyroid, oxytocin, prostaglandin. We'll talk about these. This one you can see is made up of amino acids, so this would be a peptide. Sometimes you have shorter peptides, sometimes you have rings and different functional groups. These are some of the major hormones, and again, you can pause here and look at these in more detail. I'll go through the ones that we're going to cover in more detail. So again, these types of hormones can be made of different kind of classes of macromolecules. So amines basically means it has nitrogen groups. They're from amino acids. Peptides, these are like shorter versions of proteins. So maybe they don't have as complicated of a tertiary or quaternary structure, but they're made up of amino acids. There are proteins, which is just more complex molecule. Glycoproteins means it's a protein, but it has some sugar, some carbohydrates. And then we have steroids, like cholesterol is another example of a hormone. So there's two major actions of hormones. There's steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. So the big picture here that I want you to understand is that a hormone that is a steroid hormone is going to go through the cell membrane into the cell, and in the cell is going to activate or initiate some sort of cellular activation pathway. But it's going through the cell membrane and into the cell. So that's what a steroid hormone is doing. In contrast to a non-steroid hormone is not able to cross through the cell membrane. So it needs what's called a membrane-bound receptor protein. So the hormone is still causing a change inside the cell, but instead of going into the cell, the hormone is binding this receptor on the outside of the cell, and then it causes the changes inside the cell. So again, the major difference is that a steroid hormone is going through the cell membrane, and a non-steroid hormone is just binding to a receptor on the outside of the cell, but both of them are causing some sort of signal transduction pathway inside, some sort of like genetic switch, turning something on. Okay, the first ones we'll start talking about, these are prostaglandins, and this word that says they're paracrine substances. These are hormones that work only kind of locally near the gland. So they're not stored in the cell, they're synthesized just before release. They can work on lots of different types of pathways, maybe in other like cellular and molecular biology classes or biochemistry classes. You might talk more specifically about the actual cascade pathways that these hormones are responsible for. One thing that we will see in almost all of these pathways is how tightly they're regulated. So hormones are very powerful, even in very, very small amounts. So we want to really control how much of the hormone is being released. And the way that we do this primarily is by what's called a negative feedback mechanism. This is where the product of something is going to inhibit the further production of it. So this is to maintain what's called homeostasis. You've learned about homeostasis before in other classes, but basically it's just maintaining levels that are within a specific range that are compatible with life for that cell or organism. You can kind of think of it like a thermostat, where if you had your thermostat set to 70 degrees in your house, your heat or air conditioning would come on or off to maintain that temperature. So it's being regulated to keep a certain threshold. So we'll talk a lot about negative feedback inhibition loops in a lot of these. So I'll let you pause here to look at specific examples, but we'll see this with how we regulate our blood sugar, how we regulate our blood pressure, all kinds of stuff like that. Here's another example of negative feedback inhibition, where the product of one step is going to come back and inhibit the production of more of that hormone. So again, this is just to prevent too much hormone from being made. Okay, so let's talk about the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is in our brain, and it has two distinct portions. I'm just going to refer to them as the anterior and the posterior lobe. So here this is showing a cross section of the brain and where the pituitary gland is, and you can see here the anterior and the posterior lobes of the pituitary gland. These are endocrine glands, so they are secreting hormones, and they control most of the endocrine system between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus that we'll talk about next. So in the pituitary gland, we have the anterior lobe, and the anterior lobe mostly has hormones that have whatever name, and then it's that name hormone releasing hormone. So it basically tells it to release that hormone. So it's kind of like a priming step that is getting ready to release the hormone that is needed. And then the posterior lobe, this releases whatever that hormone is into the bloodstream. So you'll see here lots of examples of negative feedback inhibition, where the green arrows are indicating something being stimulated and the red arrows are representing something being inhibited. So more feedback inhibition. So the anterior pituitary hormones, these are usually hormones that are well, these are the major hormones that are being released by the anterior pituitary hormone. Growth hormone, so this is responsible for cell division when something is growing. Prolactin, this is responsible for stimulating milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to stimulate other hormones. And then adrenocorticotropic hormone, this is responsible for releasing cortisol. We'll talk more about cortisol later, which is mostly a stress hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, these are both involved in gamete production and sex hormones. So this is showing the different hormones from that originate in the hypothalamus, a different part in the brain, and then it tells the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland, and then they go on to release these hormones, and we'll see them in different organs in the body. The posterior pituitary hormones are the antidiuretic hormones. It's vasopressin. This is involved in resorbing water, so we don't want to just be excreting all of the water through our kidneys and into our urine. We want to resorb and not get rid of all of the extra water in our cells. That is regulated by this vasopressin. And then oxytocin. And oxytocin is usually referred to as the love hormone, and it's responsible for maternal bonding. Also, we see oxytocin in just any kind of human contact. You can see your oxytocin levels go up, even with when you're having contact with your pets. If you're petting your dog or cat, your oxytocin levels go up, their oxytocin levels go up. So you can pause here. This is the overview of the hormones of the pituitary gland, showing both the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, the actions and their source of control. The next gland that we'll talk about is the thyroid gland. So this is anterior to your trachea, just below your larynx. And it has 2 lobes. And it produces 3 hormones. So there's T4, T3, and calcitonin. So we're going to look at all of these in more detail here in a second. But T4 is the precursor to T3, and T3 is the active hormone. So T4, T3, and then calcitonin. And calcitonin is what we use to help absorb extra calcium into our bones. We also will see a lot more about calcitonin when we talk about the urinary system later. So here's a picture of the structure of the gland, the follicular cells. This is where we are releasing the hormone. And this is a picture of 2 of the hormones, the T4 and the T3. So the numbers 3 and 4 come from the number of iodines that you're seeing that are on these molecules. So this is T3 because it has 1, 2, 3 iodines. This is the active version of the hormone, and this is T4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the inactive precursor to T3. Here are some conditions that are caused by disorders of the thyroid gland. You can pause here and take a look at these. One of these pretty common, Hashimoto's disease. This is an autoimmune disorder where your immune system destroys the cells of your thyroid, and this results in hypothyroidism. So hypo would mean not enough hormones from your thyroid, and then some of these result in hyperthyroidism, which would be an overproduction of thyroid hormones. The next endocrine gland that we'll talk about is the parathyroid gland, and the parathyroid gland secretes this PTH hormone, parathormone, and this is involved in regulating calcium and phosphorus in your bloodstream. We'll see a picture of this in a minute. Again, this is the structure of the parathyroid. There's 4 glands, 2 on each side, the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid, so it's here next to the thyroid. You can see here the pharynx. And then back here, this white part is the trachea. Parathyroid hormones, again, this is involved in calcium absorption. Vitamin D is an important cofactor that is necessary in the absorption of calcium. So some exposure to ultraviolet light is actually important because we get vitamin D from the ultraviolet light, and that's important in absorbing calcium from the foods that we're eating. And again, this is regulated by this parathyroid hormone. This is an example of an antagonistic hormone where you can see stimulation and inhibition to regulate homeostasis to make sure that there is the correct amount of calcium in our bloodstream. So it would regulate how much calcium is staying in our bloodstream and how much calcium is leaving our bloodstream to go to bone formation or to other processes. So here I'll let you pause here if you'd like to take a look at this, and this is showing the difference between hyper and parathyroidism here. So the next endocrine system gland that we'll talk about is the adrenal glands, and usually you associate adrenal glands with adrenaline. That's where the word comes from. It also releases, well, adrenaline is epinephrine, and then norepinephrine are the two major hormones that are released by the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, ad means on top of, so they're here on top of the kidneys, and the word for kidney is renal, so adrenal means on top of the kidneys. This is showing where they're located, and then these are the hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine, and what their responses are in different organ systems. Comparing the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Let's see. So this is showing how these hormones of the adrenal cortex, aldosterone, cortisol, and adrenal androgens, how these are regulating different processes like blood pressure. They regulate ions. They regulate the ions that are in the water in our cells. Cortisol, this is important in stress responses, so it helps our body respond to stress differently. And then the adrenal androgens, these are the sex hormones from the gonads that can be used to maybe converted into estrogen, depending on the sex. Okay, the next thing that we'll talk about is the pancreas. And the pancreas really has an example of acting as both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So we'll see the structure here in a second. It secretes hormones like an endocrine gland, and then it also secretes digestive enzymes into ducts like an exocrine gland. So it acts as both exocrine and endocrine. So here's the structure. Here is the pancreas, and you see it's right here next to the small intestine. So the pancreas is doing a lot of different things. Its role as an exocrine gland is by secreting digestive enzymes through these ducts that then go directly into the small intestine. So remember, for it to be exocrine, it releases it into a duct, and that's the location. It's not traveling through the bloodstream to a different target somewhere else in our body. So that's how the pancreas acts as an exocrine gland. The way that the pancreas acts as an endocrine gland is that these cells in the pancreas here, called the islets of Langerhans, these are the cells that produce the hormones called the pancreatic islet. And these are hormones that are involved in regulating blood sugar, glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. So glucagon is a hormone that's released when there is low intracellular glucose. It means the glucose is gone. So when there's low intracellular glucose, glucagon is secreted, and that stimulates processes in our cells to put more glucose back into the bloodstream. And this would have been something we talked about in biochemistry or maybe cellular and molecular biology. This would activate pathways like gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis that are going to break down stored glucose as glycogen or start making glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors like gluconeogenesis. The other hormone, insulin, this is a hormone that is released when there's a lot of glucose around and we want to bring glucose into the cells, or we need to store it because we have more glucose than we need. Again, these are examples of antagonist hormones, and they are helping to regulate homeostasis. So regardless of when the last time you ate was, your blood glucose levels don't look like this. They are just staying kind of at a more level concentration. And again, here's another picture of this. You can pause here to look at this, just showing how negative feedback and how these two hormones that have opposite roles in regulating blood sugar work together. Here are some other kind of secondary endocrine glands that we won't talk a ton about, but there's the pineal gland. This is also in your brain. This helps regulate melatonin. Melatonin has kind of been popular lately where people are taking melatonin to help you sleep. This regulates your circadian rhythms, which are determined by daylight, and this is what helps you sleep and be sleepy at the end of the day is how much melatonin you have. You also can take melatonin as a supplement. Some people have good results with taking melatonin to help them sleep. Some of the questions about that are if you're taking a lot of extra melatonin, will your body start producing less melatonin? That's kind of the latest that I've heard about that on if taking melatonin as a sleep aid is a good idea. The thymus gland, this is important in immunity. We're going to talk a lot about the immune system later, and we'll revisit this thymus gland that are going to be important for lymphocyte development. And then the reproductive organs, we'll talk about reproduction a lot later, and we'll see some of these hormones that are involved there. Let's see. The last thing to talk about are types of stress and responses to stress. So survival just depends on maintaining homeostasis in many different categories: blood pressure, body temperature, blood glucose levels, pH, all of that. There's a very tight window of what is compatible for life, and a lot of energy and cellular processes are their only job is to regulate these living conditions within a very small window. So factors that change that internal environment, these are called stressors. And usually this is recognized by nerve impulses to the hypothalamus, which then tells our body there is a stress, and it releases a hormone. And this is kind of where we get that flight or fight response to stress. So it can either be a physical stress or a psychological stress that can activate these pathways. So again, hormones are different than the nervous system and neural signals, but they work together oftentimes. So over here, this sympathetic impulse, this would be fast. So immediately when there's a stress, you have this epinephrine and norepinephrine released, and this is like the initial fight or flight alarm response where your blood glucose increases, where now you're ready to make a lot of ATP to have energy to run or fight or do whatever you need to do. Your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, your air passageways dilate, your pupils dilate, so you're taking in more light, you can see more. And it redistributes your blood flow. So for example, if you had just eaten a big meal or something and a lot of your blood flow was going to your digestive system, now in this immediate stress, your blood would start going to your muscles, ready to prepare you for what you might need to do next. So that's the immediate fast response. The slower side over here, this prolonged stressful situation, this is like the long-term response, would be from your anterior pituitary and your adrenal cortex, which is also going to help you adjust and resist to whatever this stress was. So I would let you pause here and see this summary of how general stress is responded to by our endocrine system. So this is going to conclude the lecture on the endocrine system. Major things to take away are the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands, how they're regulated, why is homeostasis important, the location and types of hormones that different glands secrete. And I think that's it.